Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Megan Bryan, and some people asked me if I would do a Zoom of the vampire talk I gave today on May the 4th, and so I have. And so this is going to be it. Let me see if I can share the screen with you right now. Then you can see the PowerPoint. That's Whitby. That's actually where Dracula lands. Okay, good. I think we're good. So let me just dive right into this. So blood drinking creatures have been described since time immemorial in almost every country and culture in the world. But the creature we would call a vampire today was first described in writing in 18th century Eastern Europe, although its roots are ancient. In 1718, when the Habsburg Empire regained parts of Serbia and Wallachia from the Ottoman Empire, known as the Peace of Passarowitz here, Austrian officials began to notice and report on the destruction of so-called vampires by local residents who would exhume and then mutilate the dead bodies of their friends and neighbors. A public inquiry into vampires was launched by the Austrian government in 1731. The people who carried out these inquiries were learned representatives, trusted and educated pillars of the community, such as the report on Peter Blagojevich from the imperial provisor of the Gradisk district, now part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And these kinds of officials lent the myth more credit to similarly educated outsiders. The imperial provisor describes Peter Blagojevich falling off a truck, dying suddenly, and then a couple nights later returning from the dead to greet his wife and then his neighbors. And his neighbors start falling sick and dying, so they suspect there's a vampire in the village. They exhume his body. They see there's blood on his mouth. So they drive a stake through the body, and blood comes out of the mouth, cut off the head, and then burn it and scatter the ashes to the four winds. And the account concludes with, I inform the most laudable administration, and at the same time would like to request, obedient and humbly, that if a mistake was made in this matter, such is to be attributed not to me, but to the rabble, who are beside themselves with fear. So the lesson there is that unelected bureaucrats never change. So the vampire myth is really an attempt by pre-scientific cultures to make sense of observed connections between death, burial, and decay. It's a supernatural belief with roots in the scientific process of observation, inquiry, and conclusion. Vampires were traditionally harbingers of plagues, wars, and famine, and that's because if you didn't understand what caused a plague, it would be easy enough to just blame a vampire. There's a wonderful book by Paul Barber called Vampires, Burial, and Death, Folklore and Reality. And he talks about the science of what happens when a body actually decays and how that could be mistaken for a lot of the signs of vampirism. So the blood coming out of the mouth is actually something that happens when gases are released from the body and the lungs are pushed up, and then they push up blood through the mouth and the nose. So that's just decay, but it's mistaken for vampirism. These are some of the attributes of the vampire. They're suspected after mass death in the village. That's the association with plagues there. They always attack their own family first and then spread to the rest of the village. Vampires come at night to smother or throttle the sleeper in their bed. In a lot of the movies, you see the victim dying of blood loss eventually. Actually, what the folkloric vampires would do is they would just strangle you. And they would drink the blood after you were dead. So how do you know if you've got a vampire? When you dig up the body, there's no signs of decay. The hair and nails have grown. There's supple limbs and fresh skin, sometimes with the devil's mark. If anyone's familiar with history of witchcraft, the devil's mark is anything that can be seen in like a mole or a freckle. It's like a Rorschach blot test. Anything unusual is blamed on the devil, and that's the devil's mark. There's also a lack of stench on the bodies, blood on the mouth, or the corpse is bloated, and this is seen as being full of blood. Dracula in the book is described as a bloated, filthy leech. And how do you become a vampire? Obviously, the easiest way to become a vampire is to be attacked by a vampire. It spreads the plague that way. Also, if you commit suicide, or if you die violently or suddenly, or if you engage in any kind of immoral behavior, and we'll talk more about this later. And anyone born with any physical abnormalities, an extra limb, an extra finger, a cowl on a baby's head, that was said to be a sign of vampirism. And this man on the slide here, Dom Calmet, anthologized a lot of these stories in the mid-18th century. And he's saying here that we're not a credulous people, and we think that science can discover the truth. And all of these very, serious officials, clergymen, bureaucrats, army officers, have all attested to the truth of this myth, the experts. So why would we doubt the experts? Seems sensible enough. So the Eastern European nations where the vampire superstition was most prevalent, such as Romania and Bulgaria, were subjected to repeated invasion attempts by the Ottoman Turks over the centuries. And the historical Dracula, Vlad III of Wallachia, spent most of his reign battling the Ottoman Empire during the 15th century. There'll be a lot more on him later. So the region with which the vampire is widely associated in this period is one of constant violence and conflict and constant fluctuating and unstable national identities. In Balkan folklore, the people who can become vampires are as follows: the godless, evildoers, suicides, in addition to sorcerers, witches, and werewolves. Among the Bulgarians, the group is expanded by robbers, highwaymen, arsonists, prostitutes, deceitful and treacherous barmaids, which I don't know what that's about, and other dishonorable people. According to Croatian folklore, a person may become a vampire if they are born of an incestuous union between a mother and a son. The association of vampirism with sexual immorality is there from its folkloric roots, but it becomes even more identified with transgressive sexuality throughout the 19th century and to an almost ridiculous degree by the 20th century, post-Freud. The first explicitly Freudian interpretation of the vampire was in an essay by Ernest Jones in 1912 called On the Nightmare. And this was originally in German. However, Jones's interpretation was not available in English until after the First World War. And the essay was not printed in its entirety in English until 1931. And since that time, the vampire and sexuality theme has been completely inseparable. My PhD thesis is actually about, it argues against the over-sectionalized interpretation of the vampire due to the inevitable Freudian readings of the figure, primarily in the 20th century. The amount of vampire and sexuality scholarship is almost overwhelming, which leads researchers to neglect or overlook other aspects of what the vampire actually means in its historical context. I was interested in exploring the contemporary beliefs of vampirism, both in the folklore and in literature through a largely pre-Freudian lens, where sometimes the stake is just a stake. Just going to pause for a second here. Okay, go. Oops, I stopped sharing. Did not mean to do that. Go back. There we go. Speaking of stakes, here's how to kill a vampire. Cut off the head, dismember the body, take off the heart, and burn it. Anything where the body's not left, so nothing can be reanimated. Also, good old-fashioned stake through the heart, usually in conjunction with beheading or burning. It's good to separate the body there. This is a picture here of Peter Cushing as Dr. Abraham Van Helsing using a hawthorn stake, wooden stake. And this here is a 13th century grave of a vampire, which was discovered in Bulgaria in 2014. And they've got an iron rod through his chest, and also the left leg was taken off so he can't get up. Which again is a very practical way. If there's no body, if there's no way for the body to walk, it can't get up. And the wood that you would use to stake a vampire is hawthorn. That's the crown of thorns that Jesus wore is hawthorn. And of course, the iron stake, Jesus was nailed to the cross with iron nails. So these are symbols in the Christian iconography, which the vampire largely comes from, that'd be powerful against it. But to do the vampire justice, it's important to note that the transgressive sexuality associations did actually happen in their historical context. So for example, the idea of keeping the bloodline pure by a noble pedigree was a particular concern to royalty and nobility during the 18th and 19th centuries. And marriage between family members was a common enough practice in order to achieve this. So the nobility condoned incest for the sake of preserving bloodlines, which is a fitting attitude for a creature who believes that the blood is the life. Many 19th century vampires were of the nobility, as we will see, but their roots are in the peasant tradition, where vampires were friends, relatives, and neighbors of the common people. So the vampire craze in the 18th century was really an early media event in which educated Europeans became aware of practices that were by no means of recent origin, but had simply been provided for the first time with effective public relations representatives. This vampire craze spread quickly to other parts of Europe. In 1746, French biblical scholar Augustin Calmet, that was the guy in the previous slide, anthologized the written material pertaining to vampire sightings and exhumations. This work was passed around among late 18th century scholars, but was virtually inaccessible beyond the educated classes due to its exclusive publication in French. And from the European continent, the belief spread to Britain. According to the writer Horace Walpole, even King George II believed implicitly in vampires. And while Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, and Matthew Lewis, among others, fed the public's appetite for tales of the Gothic and the supernatural in the late 18th century, the vampire in English remained largely absent in prose. In poetry, however, it was another story. So the previously mentioned reports of vampirism, which were anthologized, were cited in the popular works of Romantic poets, including Robert Southey's The Lob of the Destroyer in 1801, and he footnotes an eyewitness account from a 1736 record made by an officer in the Austrian army about a vampire called Arnold Powell, with similar traits to the aforementioned folkloric vampire. Lord Byron mentions a vampire in the poem The Giaour in 1813. Byron describes the vampire in the poem with similar traits to those discussed previously in the oral incarnations of the figure. It returns from the dead to drink blood and starts by destroying its own family first until its bloodline has been completely destroyed. You can see that here: ghastly haunt thy native place and suck the blood of all thy race. Flowers are withered on the stems. There's no reproduction there. It's the end of the bloodline. Lord Byron was an early, and many claim one of the first celebrities, which is sort of loosely defined as a person with a prominent personal life who exists in a three-way, almost vampiric relationship between himself, his audience, and his publishers. Byron was the subject of intense media speculation during his lifetime, thanks to his scandalous personal life. In 1816, he was forced to flee England due to rumors of sexual impropriety, including incest with his half-sister, and even more scandalous at the time, marital sodomy. By the spring of 1816, Byron's reputation was summed up as follows by his friend Mary Godfrey, quote, "The world are loud against him and vote him a worthless profligate. He is completely lost in the opinion of the world, and I fear he is the sort of character never to make an effort to recover it. So I look on him as given up to every worthless excess for the rest of his life." He left England on April 24th, 1816, in the company of a physician called John Polidori, who would become responsible for making Byron and vampirism completely inseparable. In late May of 1816, Lord Byron and Joan Polidori met up at the Villa Diodati in Switzerland with the poet Percy Shelley and his future wife, Mary Godwin, referred to as Mrs. Shelley by Polidori and Byron, although they weren't married at the time. Shelley and Byron became fast friends as they were both accomplished poets and appeared to look down on Polidori, who had literary ambitions, but according to them, no talent. The story that Mary Shelley famously recounted in the introduction to Frankenstein, her most famous work, is that on literally a dark and stormy night, Lord Byron proposed that they all write a ghost story. Mary supposedly had a dream that night of a man working on corpses in a laboratory and one of the corpses coming to life, which inspired her most famous novel, while Polidori began to work on a tale about a vampire. Published in 1819 and appropriately titled The Vampire, Polidori's book became an instant success because of its association with Byron. The story was actually published with the subtitle A Tale by Lord Byron, which was an intentional mistake on the part of Byron's publisher in order to increase sales. It worked, and for the next few decades, many unauthorized sequels and adaptations of the character of Lord Ruthven, who is the vampire, appeared in print and on stage. Even the popular perception of Byron turned slightly vampiric, according to Christopher Frayling. In Paris at the time of the novel's publication, boulevard gossips were unwittingly contributing to the sales of the book by spreading the rumor that Byron had murdered his mistress and enjoyed drinking her blood from a cup made of her cranium. The title character of the vampire is Lord Ruthven, and he's the first aristocratic vampire. Prior to 1819, vampires were usually peasants, but afterwards they're nearly exclusively of the nobility. Again, the reading public's obsession with Byron is a huge influence here, but the aristocracy also makes a good fit for a vampire. It doesn't take Karl Marx to see the metaphorical implications of a creature who literally drains the life from the working classes. Marx, in fact, did expressly compare capital to a vampire in Das Kapital in 1867, quote, "Capital is dead labor that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks." The vampire's nobility also allows them the social mobility to mix with people of all classes in order to seek out victims. There is also a mysterious aloofness associated with both the vampire and the nobility, a class with rules unto itself that the common people cannot reach. And you can see here, this is a quote from the introduction of a modern version of the vampire, that Polidori is really not doing much research into the folklore roots of the vampire. What he does is he basically puts Lord Byron, so the sort of conventional libertine character, and adds some vampiric attributes onto him. And the story is about a man called Aubrey who meets up with Lord Ruthven at a party and is sort of irresistibly drawn to him. He has this hypnotic gaze. And so he decides to accompany him across Europe. So it's sort of a semi-autobiographical work. And while they're in Greece, the vampire Lord Ruthven attacks a peasant girl called Ianthe and drinks her blood. And then he is attacked by bandits and is killed. And before he's killed, he says to Aubrey, "You can't tell anyone what's happened. Swear on your life." And Aubrey's like, "I swear." And then he goes back to England alone, and he finds out his sister's engaged to a mysterious man. It turns out to be Lord Ruthven, but he swore he couldn't say anything. And so he doesn't. And this vow of silence will be something that comes up in a lot of 19th century vampire literature, that you either can't speak about the vampire, it's too horrific, or you swore not to speak. And so the vampire doesn't really get a voice until sort of the 20th century in that time. But anyway, the setting of the vampire and his travels throughout the European continent not only reflect Byron's own enforced exile, but culminate in Greece, the country in which Byron would later meet his death, and which he actually loved enough to die for by fighting in the Greek Revolution against the Ottoman Empire. This probably has to do with Byron viewing the East as the site or birthplace of Europe's great cultural heritage, while at the same time viewing the East as a site into which one could escape from modernity and Europe itself. This foreign setting is especially prominent in the context of vampire literature, since the journey to the East in both the vampire and later Dracula is almost a literal journey to the past, where myths and superstition still hold sway over a credulous population, and the past is literally another country. The Eastern setting is also the origin of these creatures of myth and superstition, as we've seen, and the point from which they can be brought into the West for good or ill, and it's usually ill. So Lord Ruthven was a cold and calculating seducer. When he's draining Ianthe, he's like laughing. He's a very sadistic character. But by the mid-19th century, there were examples of romantic vampires who would be similar to the vampires in Twilight. The only difference is there's no happy ending for these vampires. The 19th century vampires are very much monsters, and they meet the fate of all monsters. So in 1845, the first chapter of the Penny Dreadful, Varney the Vampire, was published. The Penny Dreadful was defined in 1874 as, quote, an expressive term for those penny publications which depend more upon sensationalism than upon merit, artistic or literary, for success. The writers of such stories were often uncredited and frequently lost to time. Indeed, the authorship of Varney the Vampire or the Feast of Blood remains somewhat controversial. In 1963, a number of James Malcolm Rymer's scrapbooks and letters were unearthed, and this find has established him as the primary author of Varney the Vampire. However, it is extremely likely that the story, judging from differences in styles and syntax, had more than one author at any given time. The story of Varney the Vampire lacks a linear concept of narrative, but rather contains episodic occurrences which are often inconsistent. This is due to its nature as a serial, which was published over the course of 2 years, with 232 chapters and nearly 667,000 words. 667,000 words. That's the number I want. So one of Varney's principal features is the fearful-looking teeth projecting like those of some wild animal, hideously glaringly white and fang-like. And this is the first time the vampire is mentioned as having different teeth than a normal human being. Polidori doesn't mention Ruthven's teeth at all, so it's really Varney that they add this fang element there. The other interesting thing about Varney is that he expresses self-loathing of his condition, and the story adds a new layer to the vampire as a being who can be saved through love. We've got that part here about it is a condition with my hateful race that if we can find one human heart to love us, we are free. So vampirism in Varney the Vampire is similar to a temporary spell that can be broken through love rather than a permanent affliction. And Varney, like Ruthven, has an eye for beautiful young women, but while the story opens with an account of him menacing the attractive Flora Bannerworth in order to drink her blood, his interactions with other women in the story are much less sinister. There's even a section where a young woman and her mother try to entrap him into marriage to take advantage of his wealth and position. So Varney in the story is both predator and victim of unfortunate circumstance. And he's also obviously another aristocratic vampire. His full title is Sir Francis Varney, and he's believed to be a baronet like Lord Byron. The end of the very long serial is that he confesses his crimes to a clergyman at the end of the story, and then he decides to kill himself by throwing himself into Mount Vesuvius. He's actually died at many points throughout the serial, but due to the lack of a body, presumably could not return again this time. So you can see this is, again, one of the folkloric things. You got to get rid of the body so it can't come back. So for a more fully realized character of the romantic vampire, we turn to Irish author Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 story, Carmilla. And Carmilla is a mysterious young lady. They have it's Laura is the narrator, and she and her father live in this castle in Austria. And there's a carriage accident in front of the castle one day, and it's this older woman and Carmilla, who's the younger woman. And the older woman says she has to get going, but can you look after my daughter until she's healed? And they agree to do so, but it turns out Carmilla is in fact a vampire. And this is, again, they have this vow of silence, but Laura's cousin was killed by Carmilla, and her father writes to Laura's father and says, there's this horrible thing that's happened to my daughter, but I can't tell you what it is because it's too horrific. And if he had told her, obviously, in advance, Laura wouldn't have been victimized. So it's an interesting speech in the vampire there. So Carmilla's village has been destroyed by her curse, which echoes the belief that the vampire destroys its own family and village first. She says she's the last of her family, although the narrator Laura seems to be descended from her somehow, and Carmilla is irresistibly compelled to destroy her because of this. There's little about Le Fanu's Carmilla that resembles Polidori's Ruthven, however. Carmilla, although retained the title of nobility, so her real name is Countess Mircalla of Karnstein, but she's not an aloof aristocratic seducer. She's a passionate woman who has difficulty controlling her feelings and has these outbursts of anger. The narrator describes her as engaging as opposed to Ruthven's aloofness, and she shows affection for Laura, giving her trembling embraces and soft kisses as opposed to Ruthven's harsh treatment of his victims. So modern readings of Carmilla tend to focus on the transgressive sexuality of her character, but this reading was at least never overtly expressed during the time of its publication. While male homosexuality was outlawed and met with strong punishments, female homosexuality was, even as late as 1886, believed by some to be non-existent. Max Nordau claimed in his book Paradoxes, originally published in that year, that, quote, the sight or the idea of a person of her own sex has no power to excite a woman's sex center to any form of activity, and hence man must be her ideal of beauty. So contemporary readers of Carmilla could plausibly not notice the romantic connection between the two female characters, or rather read it as a kind of transgression that only exists in a sensational supernatural story. So Carmilla is a milestone in vampire literature, not only for its transgressive sexuality aspect, but also for reestablishing religion as having dominion over the vampire, which we'll see later in Dracula. The demonic nature of vampirism, explicit in its folkloric roots, as we discussed, was largely absent in literature until the late 19th century. This is not a new invention of Le Fanu's, but rather a return to the roots of the monster as a creature of Christian origin. And the story also describes the ambiguous feelings of the vampire's victim toward the vampire. The simultaneous attraction and repulsion is described by both Laura and later Jonathan Harker in Dracula. The other milestone in Carmilla was her ability to transform into animals. She can change into a giant cat-like creature. It's described in the story. Dracula will later be able to transform into wolves and bats, which are creatures of the night. The bat is obviously synonymous with vampires because of their blood-drinking ability, but the transformation aspect was introduced in Dracula. And Carmilla is not largely well received in her time. It was dismissed as silly and even simply ugly and repulsive. Nevertheless, her influence was felt. Carmilla was the first story in English to feature a female vampire as the central character. Between its publication in 1872 and the publication of Dracula in 1897, about 2/3 of vampire stories which were published in this quarter of a century featured the female vampire. So in Dracula, Bram Stoker returns the vampire to being an unfeeling monster. The monstrous characterization of Dracula by its author may have been due to the source of his name. There's evidence Stoker had done some research on Vlad Dracula, the ruler of Wallachia from 1456 to 62, otherwise known as the Impaler. In a time when brutality and cruelty was the order of the day, Vlad Dracula was rumored to outdo them all. Of course, all these rumors need to be taken with a pinch of salt, as Vlad made many enemies, and much of what was written about him could well be baseless propaganda. However, there are a few confirmed stories. We think this is what Vlad looks like in this portrait here. That's copied from a portrait that was painted in his lifetime, so that's going to be pretty accurate. And this here is a German woodcut panel and then a translation from a German pamphlet about how Dracula impaled this whole city and then he sets up a feast under it and has a feast while everyone's writhing and bleeding above him. That part's probably not true. The impalement of the whole city probably is. So that was the kind of guy he was. So one of the stories about Vlad Dracula that we can sort of corroborate is about Turkish ambassadors, and they're sent to treat with Vlad. And as was Turkish custom, they keep their hats on in his presence. And Dracula inquired why they did this, and they replied, it's not their custom to remove their hats. Dracula gives this kind of Joker line about he wants to strengthen their customs, and then he orders their hats nailed to their heads. And this story is confirmed by German, Russian, and Romanian sources. Another story supported by multiple sources is that of a merchant who traveled through Wallachia and had his money stolen. And he goes to see Dracula and he reimburses him what he's lost because he really hates thieves. And he gives him 1 extra ducat. So the merchant counts his money several times and goes back to Dracula and says, you gave me an extra ducat. And Dracula says, you can keep that, but if you hadn't come and told me about it, I would have impaled you because then you would have been a thief. Very anti against thieves, liars, and lazy people, as it talks about in some of these slides here. Sort of known for being very strict in an almost psychopathic way. But these are some accounts from 1972, oral accounts that Romanians have told about Vlad. And so he's still sort of seen as a kind of national hero in Romania, this sort of harsh but fair ruler. And he has this kind of Arthurian deal that in Romania's hour of need, Vlad's going to return and save everyone. So these things are usually a matter of perspective. Possibly the worst story about Vlad, because he hates lazy people and particularly beggars so much. You can see that they're useless to humanity. It's a form of thievery, so they're worse than robbers. And he invites all the poor beggars and people unable to work to an Easter feast in a church. And when they arrive, he locks the building and sets it on fire. And of course, these acts seem cruel and monstrous to us today, and also they would, of course, in the 19th century. But Vlad Tepes, as I said, is still seen as a noble figure in Romania, and his association with the vampire Dracula is actually fairly offensive to them, although they're happy to exploit this connection for tourism reasons. As with all historical figures, of course, truth can be difficult to separate from fiction, and opinions can fluctuate wildly depending on the historical context. So this is Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was published in 1897. And it's an epistolary novel, which is, of course, a novel that's different letters, journals, manuscripts, multiple narrators, multiple types of text. So it's very difficult to give a straightforward interpretation of it, which is one of the many reasons why people are so fascinated by it. And Jonathan Harker, who's one of the narrators, and he uses shorthand in his journal. And he describes this use of shorthand as 19th century up to date with a vengeance. And yet, unless my senses deceive me, the old centuries had and have powers of their own which mere modernity cannot kill. And I think this statement's a succinct summary of the novel itself. The Count Dracula is a product of the old centuries, and only primitive rituals can kill him, while modern medical advances such as blood transfusions provide him with more sustenance. The novel, as well as the characters in it, are caught between the ancient and the modern. Dracula is a creature of early superstition walking contemporary London streets. So the text marries the past and the present in an uneasy union. And that's, I think, what's so great about it. The Count describes himself as a member of a conquering race, one who, as voivode, crossed the Danube and beat the Turk on his own ground, who, when he was beaten back, came again and again and again. And that's what it says here. Of course, it's based on Vlad Dracula. And you can see from his character, he's a persistent invader who does not take defeat lightly. He's actually threatening to create a demonic empire of the dead from the living British Empire, but his methods for accomplishing this are more subtle and sinister than back in the distant past. He intends to infiltrate the population by becoming just like them. So he has a collection of English books in his castle, and he insists on Jonathan Harker correcting his English if he makes a mistake, so no one will know he's a foreigner. And so a lot of people read this as this kind of reverse colonization narrative, that it's this kind of foreign monster who comes to colonize the colonizers. And some people read it as a very anti-foreign, anti-immigrant text, but it's actually not that at all. Because one of the heroes of the novel is Dr. Abraham Van Helsing. He's, of course, Dutch. And there's also an American character who's the hero, and he's a Texan. And his name is Quincy Morris. And he's one of the men who destroys Dracula by stabbing him through the heart with a Bowie knife, while Jonathan Harker cuts off his head. And if you go to the Alamo today, they have a little display with a Bowie knife, and they mention that a Bowie knife destroyed Dracula. So don't mess with Texas. So most people know Dracula, probably not from Stoker's novel, but likely because of a movie. Dracula, along with Sherlock Holmes, is one of the most filmed literary characters in history. The novel was almost immediately adapted into a stage play, and then with the advent of cinema in the 1920s, plagiarized by German director F.W. Murnau in the form of the 1922 silent film Nosferatu. This was an adaptation of the novel that attempted to circumvent copyright law, but Bram Stoker's widow sued Murnau for copyright infringement, and all copies of the movie were supposed to be destroyed, but they weren't. So the film attempted unsuccessfully to avoid copyright issues by distancing itself from Stoker's text, renaming the vampire Count Orlok and making his death nothing like the race against time in the novel. Rather, the destruction of Orlok is brought about by the heroine after reading a passage in the Book of Vampires that states, quote, "Only a woman can break the vampire's frightful spell, a woman pure in heart, who will offer her blood freely to Nosferatu and will keep the vampire by her side until after the cock has crowed." So the sexual implications of the passage are obvious there. It's not enough that the vampire's bloodlust be sated, but you also have to keep him there all night. But Nosferatu's effect on future vampire cinema and the public perception of vampires cannot be overstated. The film's ending is the first instance of a vampire being destroyed by sunlight, which will become a common feature in later vampire fiction. Carmilla's out walking the daylight, Dracula's out walking the daylight. The sunlight doesn't seem to affect them. They just tend to stay in their graves during the day because they want to go out at night. And that's the only time they have to sleep. But they can pass for normal people. There's no reason why the sun would harm them. But since Nosferatu, they decided that's the thing. Nosferatu is a very eerie film, and it's an uncomfortable watch in its historical context of 1920s Germany. Orlok's appearance is a recognizable caricature of the Jew, large hook-nosed, claw-like fingers and bushy eyebrows, and he's a plague bearer who preys upon virtuous Aryan women. Adolf Hitler described the Jews as Blutsauger, which is bloodsucker, in Mein Kampf in 1925, which is 3 years after Nosferatu was released. The uncomfortable associations of the vampire with the foreign other have always been there, but they're made explicit in Nosferatu in a particularly anti-Semitic way. And the film is sort of just anti-Semitic propaganda. It's sort of an uncomfortable watch. But cinema in particular has provided what might be termed a vampire stereotype in popular culture. So Bela Lugosi's 1931 portrayal of Dracula is so iconic. It's based on the stage play version. There are no special effects in the movie and not many action scenes, and the movie relies solely on Lugosi's magnetic performance and that of an impressive supporting cast. The sexuality aspect of the vampire is toned down for this version because it's 1931. So while Dracula still menaces beautiful women, it all happens off screen. And they talk about the next day that he came and drank the blood from my wrist rather than the neck. So that's a bit too sexy. In post-war cinema in Britain, the depiction of vampirism is still censored, but it's getting more suggestive. In 1958, Christopher Lee's Dracula is given limited screen time compared to earlier versions. However, he projects, as film historian Jonathan Rigby describes, a mixture of erotic magnetism and animalistic ferocity, which, though vividly present in Bram Stoker's novel, had never before been captured on screen. And that's why his, in my humble opinion, is the best. He just nails that character. So in more recent years, the vampire has retained its erotic appeal, but taken on the aspect of romantic lover rather than aggressive seducer. Gary Oldman's Dracula and Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992 is cursed with vampirism after his wife dies, and his attraction to Mina arises from her resemblance to his dead wife. She's this kind of reincarnated figure. The film, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, deviates from the novel by turning Dracula into a tragic romantic figure, doomed to live a meaningless life through the centuries until he can be reunited with his true love. So the tagline on the film poster, "Love Never Dies," seems to contradict the film's title as a faithful adaptation of Stoker's novel, because that's not what the novel is actually about. So Bela Lugosi's distinctive accent appears in parodies of the figure, such as the Count in Sesame Street. So Dracula is therefore a familiar character from childhood, even though a child might not be familiar with the source material, or at least you hope not. As with Count Chocula there, the joke of the Count only works if you're familiar with Count Dracula. Similarly, in the recent Hotel Transylvania films, Dracula insists that he does not use the catchphrase blah, 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 which is repeatedly quoted in the film when his name is mentioned, and is actually a reference to a parody version of Bela Lugosi's Dracula by comedian Lenny Bruce in the 1960s. So it's the parody of the parody of the parody. Mel Brooks's Dracula Dead and Loving It is a full-length feature parody of many Dracula adaptations. So parody obviously relies on the audience's familiarity with what is being mocked, and the fact that all ages recognize Dracula proves how pervasively the vampire has infused popular culture. But of course, one of the effects of parody is the neutralization of threat in its target. So if you mock something, you're not scared of it. And I think that's part of the reason why vampires aren't as intimidating anymore. So in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, there does seem to be a renewed attempt to rehumanize vampires, notably in UNT's own Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series. Rice's first vampire novel, Interview with the Vampire from 1976, involves an interview with a sympathetic vampire. By the end of the story, the interviewer Daniel begs to be made into a vampire by the narrator Louis, who is surprised by his request since he told his story in an attempt to illustrate the agony he suffers as a vampire, rather than to make the vampire life appealing to a mortal. So Rice's narrative acknowledges the ambiguity of the vampire. It's both a horrible state of existence and yet somehow seductive. So Rice's vampires with moral dilemmas and genuine emotions would be the prototype for Stephenie Meyer's vegetarian vampires, who refuse to drink human blood and feel undying and monogamous love for others. Twilight's often read in the context of Meyer's Mormon beliefs, abstaining from sex until after marriage. Similarly, Rice's vampires are frequently read as a metaphor for the AIDS crisis, during which they were largely published. Buffy the Vampire Slayer is often interpreted through a feminist lens, and the appeal to teenage audiences in Buffy, Twilight, and shows like The Vampire Diaries have reinterpreted the characters as hot bad boys and goth girls with angsty teenage problems. This is nothing new, as the vampires always personified human anxieties from the time in which they were written, but I argue that the singular focus on sexuality and romanticism has led to the vampire losing some of its bite, if you'll excuse the pun. The reason for that is I love this quote by Glenys Byron about turning a cold, alienating, interpersonal monster obsessed with power and possession into the hero of eternal romance. We humanize our own creations, our own late 20th century vampires, giving them infusions of good blood to save them, or turn their passionless bites into gentle exchanges, force them to anguish over moral questions, transform them into glamorous, estate, sensitive, lonely immortals, redemptive, holy babies. We have lost the truth throughout the true violence of Stoker's King Vampire. I think that's very true. And I think that's because it's the over-romanticization, or rather the romance being the sole focus of the vampire tale, which is a new development in the 20th century. It's romance to the exclusion of all else, including the recognition of the murderous and monstrous nature of the vampire. Eternal romance is the reward of vampirism, and therefore becoming a vampire is not actually a punishment. This is an uneasy interpretation in a figure that literally murders to survive, and it robs the vampire of some of its depths, which can be seen when examined in its historical context. The modern vampire is largely a metaphor, a plot device, a means to an end, not a creature in its own right with its own history and mythology. And one of the reasons I think that Dracula is so pervasive is because the history and mythology aspects of the vampire were made explicit in Stoker's novel. He did his research, and that explains in part, I think, its enduring appeal. So the reason why Dracula is such an enduring tale is because I believe Stoker was able to bring together both the folklore and the literary vampire, the ancient and the modern, the science and the superstition, into a well-crafted and exquisitely balanced narrative, so none of these elements overrides or overpowers the other. This quote here from Jonathan Harker, that's Christopher Lee's Dracula personifying that quote. It's so, his performance is so good. So the Count's a demonic figure who is nevertheless attractive in a forbidden and transgressive way. He cannot have the ideal match made in heaven of eternal love because he's not a creature of heaven. The novel was written in the end of the 19th century, where attitudes towards sexuality are much less liberated than they are today. And yet the sexuality that a modern reader sees in the novel was not considered a particularly risque in its time, which it certainly is now. The novel brings together apparently contradictory elements into a cohesive whole narrative, and the power is in how well these disparate elements all work together. If you haven't read the novel by Bram Stoker, by Dracula, I highly recommend that you do. It's absolutely fantastic. And I also highly recommend that everyone watch, for my money, the best version of Dracula ever filmed, which is Hammer Films' 1958 version called Dracula in the UK, or Horror of Dracula in the USA, to avoid Universal Studios copyright. Lots of copyright litigations with Dracula. This version doesn't follow the narrative of the novel at all, but the characterization of Dracula, as played by Christopher Lee, is absolutely perfect. And the death scene, a part of which is showing here, while nowhere near book accurate, is amazing. Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing are, to me at least, the definitive Dracula and Van Helsing. And the other reason I mention these gentlemen today, May the 4th, 2022, is because it's Star Wars Day. And they both appeared in that franchise. albeit at different times and in different movies, one much better than the other. I'll let you guess which. But I did want to end on a nerdy note. So happy Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you. And please reach out if you have any other questions about this talk. I'm very happy to talk vampires all the time. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much. Let me just stop all this. All right. See you later.